Okay.
Yay, perfect.
Can see it now. Thanks,
I can see them
Aaron.
now, yeah.
Okay, wonderful, great. Sorry, just some starting off difficulties. Right, so thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I'm really excited to be here and to talk about the impacts of COVID-19 on learning loss and inequality. This is joint work together with my friends and colleagues, Per Engsel and Mark Verhagen, who, like me, are at the Leverhulme Center for Demographic Science at the University of Oxford. And this paper, or this presentation, is largely based on a paper that we wrote together, which was published in PNAS about a year ago. So, as other people have mentioned, school closures have been one of the sort of main non-pharmaceutical interventions that governments throughout the world have implemented in an effort to curb the spread of COVID-19. As you can see here, at some point, virtually sort of all countries throughout the world implemented some form of school closures. And unlike other, or like relative to other policies, school closures are also somewhat sticky in the sense that they take a fairly long time to be revoked or reduced once they've been implemented. Now, at the time of the actual implementation of these school closures, governments throughout the world and educators throughout the world were sort of concerned over the impact that these school closures would have for student learning. Sort of the UN called it, the largest disruption to education in history, with about 95% of the world's school population being affected. And so parents and educators and students understandably were concerned what the impact of those closures would be for learning outcomes. But the problem was that data to actually understand and to study the consequences of these school closures was extremely hard to come by. And that's because testing data actually takes a long time to be released to the public, if it is released at all. And so we are actually only now seeing, more and more studies that sort of look at, or that try to unpack the impact that these school closures have had on student learning. So in our study, we were sort of fortunate to very early on have access to exceptionally rich data from the Netherlands. And so we're able to evaluate the effect of school closures on student learning during the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, the other reason for why it's sort of difficult to obtain robust estimates of how...
Aaron, just to say, are your slides supposed to be changing? Because we've still got the first slide.
Oh no. Okay, well, that's problematic. Okay, so can you, they have been changing.
Yeah,
let me just...
We've got a new one now. I think, have you got, maybe if you don't have the slides on your screen, it pauses.
Can you see them now? Can you see them move now?
Yeah.
Okay, apologies for that. So you haven't missed too much, okay?
Thanks.
So one of the reasons for why it's sort of difficult to obtain robust estimates for the impact of school closures on student learning is because you actually need a fairly you need sort of fairly detailed data. For one, you need information both before and after the schools closed. You also need a credible control group, and you need to find a good way to adjust for sort of attrition in your sort of sample, right? And so if you look at, for example, the plots down here, if you would just compare sort of 2 years with one another, it'd be problematic because you would sort of have this underlying time trend in performance over time that you would have to somehow adjust for in your analysis. And so you really need to be able to have access to, really kind of quite detailed data on really quite detailed testing data. Right, I hope my slides are moving now, and please interrupt me if you can't see them. So in this paper, we rely on the Dutch educational system, which conveniently for us conducts nationally standardized tests twice in an academic year, once midway through and once at the end of the academic year. And so we, through a partnership with a private institution, were able to obtain access to a representative sample of around 15% of all students, of all primary school students in the Netherlands, which equates to around 350,000 students. And because this is individual level data, we are not only able to examine the overall impact of the school closures, but also look at how the impact differs across student characteristics and across study subjects. Great. So as I said, there are these nationally standardized tests across the Netherlands, which take place twice in an academic year, once midway through the academic year at around January and February, and once at the end of the academic school year at around June and July. And you can see that in 2020, the school closures happened right in between those two testing moments. And so this, fortuitously for us, allows us to compare students' progress at the end of the year test to their performance at the middle of the year test, and then compare that progress to performance in the previous 3 years where there was no lockdown. Now, you can already see here that attrition is a serious problem in 2020 after the schools reopened, where much fewer students sort of returned to take the test after schools reopened relative to previous years. And this is not only a concern in the Netherlands, but is in fact a concern across the world, where sort of schools only selectively tested every second classroom, or only selectively tested some students. And so we really need to find a way to address this attrition to have any trust in our effect estimates. And sort of I'm going to talk you through what we did to ease your concerns later in our presentation. Now, the analysis lends itself, or the data lends itself very well to a pretty straightforward difference in differences design, where we compare students' progress in 2020 at the end of the year test, so after the schools reopened, to the middle of the year test, so before schools closed, and then compare that progress to progress in the previous 3 years where there were no school closures. And so our main analysis is a pooled analysis from 2017 to 2019, where our sort of variable of interest is T, right, which denotes the treatment year, so 2020, when the schools actually closed. And to get sort of more accurate estimates, we also control for the time between the time that elapsed between the testing dates, as well as for a linear time trend. Note that the testing grades that we look at are in percentile terms. And so we actually expect there to be no movement on average between the middle of the year and the end of the year test. So that means that if a student performs at the 50th percentile at the middle of the year test, on average, we expect them to perform at the 50th percentile during the end of the year test. Of course, some students will perform better or worse than expected. And if you look at the raw difference, this is actually exactly what we see. So for 2017 to 2019, we see that our estimates, sort of this difference clusters nicely around 0 with some sort of random variation on either side across all our 3 didactic areas, so maths, reading, and spelling, as well as for our composite score. But then we also see that in 2020, which is here marked in red, we can sort of see a marked leftward shift in that distribution, which already suggests that sort of some learning loss took place, right? And this is what we can see sort of more specifically when we look at the main results. Here we can see that on average, students lost about 3 percentile points in the national distribution relative to a normal year. So that means that if a student performed at the 50th percentile prior to the lockdown, they now performed at the 47th percentile after the lockdown. Most problematically, students from disadvantaged social backgrounds were particularly affected. Sort of students whose parents have very low parental education suffered losses up to 55% greater than their more educated peers, which really sort of confirmed some of the worst worries that educators and researchers had going into the pandemic, that the pandemic would not only lead to an overall loss of learning, but would also exacerbate inequalities between sort of more advantaged and more disadvantaged students. By contrast, we find no marked differences across student sex, student grade, or subject domain. Now, to validate the assumptions of our identification strategy, we sort of replicate the analysis, but use 2018 and 2019 as the treatment year. And because no lockdown took place during those times, you would obviously expect there to be no effect. And this is exactly what we find here. So you can see that our effect estimates sort of cluster nicely around 0 with some random variation across the 2 years. So this sort of validates the assumptions of our identification strategy. But obviously the issue that still remains is the problem of attrition that I highlighted earlier. And that is that many pupils in 2020 did not take the end of the year test. And so we want to find a way to address this issue to really have confidence in our effect estimates. And the way sort of you can see this problem in the 2 histograms on the right-hand side, whereas in 2019, most students across most schools took the end of the year test. In 2020, there seemed to be a lot of schools where no student was tested, or where only sort of every second or every third or every fourth student was sort of selectively tested. And so to address this issue, we sort of do a number of things. First, we throw a bunch of additional controls at the regression to see whether that changes the estimates. Then we restrict the analysis to only those schools where at least 75% of pupils underwent the test. Then we do some fancier things such as propensity score weighting or entropy balancing. And last but not least, in a sort of most stringent test, we only look at, we use school and family fixed effects to control for unobserved differences at the school or family level. But basically, regardless of what we throw at our results, they remain incredibly stable. Our effects remain nearly identical across all specifications and actually end up being slightly larger for school and sibling fixed effects. And so this sort of suggests that it's not attrition that is driving the results of our analysis. Now, the question that remains is whether the effects that we observe are actually reflect sort of loss of knowledge learned, or whether these are due to more transient sort of day of exam effects, right? And this is because lots of things obviously changed during COVID. And so students may simply be not used may not be used to the new testing environment or unaccustomed to the new testing environment or under stress. And so the loss, the change in performance might reflect those day of exam effects rather than sort of knowledge learned. And so we can see this, we can actually examine this effect by looking at tests that were also conducted in the same environment, but that were not meant to test curricular content. And so you can see here that if we repeat the analysis for those tests, the effect size shrinks by 2/3, implying that knowledge learned is the main channel that is sort of responsible for our effects. We also see quite some variation at the school level. So even though we observe a sort of 3 percentage point change on average, some schools fare much, much worse than this. And some few schools, on the other hand, seem to suffer only minor or no losses. And this sort of at face value suggests that, decisions at the school and teacher level might actually play an important role in mitigating the negative effects or some of the negative effects of the school closures. And this is, I think, a really important avenue of future research, especially considering, or especially in sort of helping us think through the policies that might work in the future to sort of mitigate future learning losses or to sort of mitigate the existing losses that have already occurred. Great. So what does sort of 3 percentile point reduction in test scores actually mean? Measured as progress in a typical year, it implies that students lost out on about 15 to 20% of a year of quality adjusted schooling. And this equates almost perfectly to the amount of time that schools actually remained closed for the school year, which means that, so the upshot of this is that students made little to no progress while learning from home during the first lockdown in the Netherlands. and this is perhaps particularly concerning because the Netherlands in many ways is was unusually well prepared for the challenges of online learning. The country has one of the highest rates of broadband adoption across Europe, with more than 90% of households, even among the poorest quartile, having broadband access at home. It had a relatively short lockdown, a strong policy response, and a fairly equitable school system. And still we find these sizable effects, which suggests losses many times larger in countries that weren't prepared in the same way. And in fact, a meta-analysis by Per Engsel and colleagues suggests that other countries have in fact faced harsher challenges. So here's our study. I'm sorry, this is a bit small, but the effect estimates of our study are down here, and studies that have been conducted since suggest that other countries have been much more affected by these school closures. And in fact, not only has there been an overall decline in learning, but there's also been an increase in inequality across most of these studies. Great, so with that, I'd love to wrap up this presentation. So just to summarize, school shutdowns due to COVID-19 have been the largest disruption to education that that we've seen in recent years. Based on the results that I've presented here, these disruptions will have dire consequences for learning for students who have learned very little compared to what they would have learned in the previous year. And losses were more concentrated among those students from less educated homes. In our case, students in the category of lower parental education suffered losses up to 55% larger than their more advantaged peers. However, of course, there's some important caveats with this analysis. Importantly, other dimensions. School is not only for learning, but also is incredibly important for non-cognitive development and for mental health. And so these factors likely play a really important role in these estimates and in student well-being more generally. And I think we'll learn more about that later. Another important caveat is that the first shutdown may have been more severe due to the abrupt nature of the event, and so schools might have been better able to mitigate future losses as they have become more prepared or more attuned to the challenges down the line. Great. So with that, I'd like to wrap up the presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to any questions or comments that you may have.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Arun, for that really interesting, insightful talk. We have a couple of questions in the chat, which I'll go to first. So did you look at differences across socioeconomic deprivation status, or did you just use parents' education as a proxy?
That's a great question. So we were somewhat limited in the amount of individual level data that we had available. At the individual level data, we had information on parental education, but we didn't have information on income or parental occupation, which prevented us from doing an analysis, doing some more detailed analysis on that front. But we had that information at the school level, and so we could look at, the school level treatment effect and see to what extent that correlated with socioeconomic status or deprivation level at this neighborhood or school level. And we find that there's a similar negative correlation there, right? So that was, it's obviously not as robust as the individual level analysis that we present in our main study, but yeah, that was one way in which you tried to triangulate these findings.
Great. That was, sorry, I should have said that was a question from Jasmina. And that actually speaks a little bit to Tristan's question, which is, did you look at the impact of school level characteristics? So were there any other school level characteristics you're able to incorporate?
Yes, so we have a wide range of neighborhood variables, including immigrant status. So share of immigrants in the neighborhoods or foreign nationals in the neighborhoods, neighborhood deprivation. I think those were the sort of two main factors that we looked at. And I think the most intense negative correlation was for neighborhood deprivation that we found. And in subsequent analysis, sort of in subsequent robustness checks, we tried to sort of account for these differences as well and see whether that sort of changed our results.
Wonderful. I've got a quick question. Is there an opportunity to continue this on a longer term basis and look at potential like regains in learning loss over the next few years?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in fact, we did a follow-up study for where we looked at, we repeated the analysis, and looked at whether schools and teachers were able to mitigate some of these negative consequences. And we find that actually there seem to have been a sort of catching up effect that has happened where progress improved overall. So the gap narrowed, but the overall inequality persisted. So we don't find the same overall learning loss, but we find a similar difference between advantaged and sort of students with parents with high education and students with a lower parental education. That's quite interesting. What makes it a little bit more challenging is that the test was actually delayed. And so that obviously meant that students had more time to prepare for the actual tests. And we tried to account for this, but it's a little less clean, I would say, than the current study, which was kind of nice because there was this, disruptive school closure, and then testing happened as it did in prior years.
For sure. Great. Thanks so much, Arun. We're going to move on now. So thank you very much for that. That was great. Next we have Tamsin Newlove.